Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you're new here. I'm Christine, and today we are in the sewing room because we're going to be doing a sew along of my newest coat pattern called the Crosby. So the Crosby, it's an asymmetrical, easy fitting jacket. It has this scarf, kind of attached scarf feature on one of the sides, and you've got a dropped shoulder, as well as one of the features that I like is it's a forward side seam. So the side seam is forward from the actual side. And then we have just a really simple a side seam pocket. But because the seam is forward, we're able to do the side seam pocket, and it's really comfortable to get your hand in. So I love kind of these details because they're really simple to sew, but you still get the comfort. And while I love tailoring, I love walt pockets, bound buttonholes, and all of the traditional tailoring that jackets can sometimes have, this one is a very simplified version, but with the scarf feature, you still have that dose of style, which is so fun. So the coat has a little collar in the back, so we're going to go over how we attach that, as well as the lining. So it is fully lined. This is my pink version. And so I definitely want to cover how we're going to construct the jacket, but then some of the details, like how we're going to finish the lower part of each front with our facing and our lining. So we're going to cover that as well. So for fabrics for this coat, this pink is actually like a boucle wool that I had in my stash for quite some time. You can use a boiled wool blends, even sweatshirt fleece. I myself have not made it in sweatshirt fleece, but I think a really nice, thick sweatshirt fleece without a lot of stretch would be just absolutely cozy and gorgeous, and maybe kind of a little bit more sporty. You can use a heavy flannel. You could use, boucle, tweed. So really it just depends on how warm of a coat you like, what season it is, and all of those things. But today I'm going to be using this vintage quilt that my mom had given me several years ago, and it's been just hiding out in my closet. It does have several stains on it, so I will be doing some cutting around them and then also some embroidery to cover up the stains. But I am so excited to have a coat out of this quilt. It's going to be appearing out of the closet and onto life again. So we're going to be using this quilt today. I've already gone ahead and cut out my lining. So it is a fully lined jacket. So as far as pieces go, I do want to mention, because this is an asymmetrical style, meaning one side has the scarf and the other side has, which I forgot to mention with the features, has a little optional snap or button closure where you take the right side and you button it underneath, and then the scarf side goes over. So it is asymmetrical, which means you have to be really careful when you're cutting, because you want all of your pieces facing upwards. And I marked all of the pieces, basically the front right and the front left, as well as the front right and the front left facings are really the only pieces that you need them all facing up. Or if you want to change and put the scarf on this side, you want to put them all facing down. So especially important if your fabric has a right side and a wrong side that's really noticeable, you have to cut all the pieces with the patterns facing up. The patterns are marked, so hopefully, it's pretty clear, but that's really important because of this asymmetrical style. So you're gonna need, obviously, your front right, your front left, your back, and your sleeves, and the collar. And then you're going to have your right front facing and your left front facing. And then as far as lining goes, you're going to have your sleeves, your back, and your front. So for the lining, the front lining pieces are both the same because they just, are the same. They kind of come in here, they attach to the facings. I do also have in the instructions to cut interfacing. So you want to line your front right facing, your front left facing, and one of your collars. With today's project, I'm actually not going to be using interfacing with my quilt. I sometimes I don't use interfacing. I know sometimes I just don't like the stiffness of it. And when I do use interfacing, I use the most lightest weight knit interfacing that I can find. But I just don't think that I don't want any extra bulkiness or stiffness or structure using this quilt fabric. So I'm not going to do the interfacing, but you should probably do the interfacing, especially if you have a lighter weight, like this boucle is quite fine, or like your flannels or anything like lighter weight, you definitely want to use an interfacing. And if you haven't already printed your pattern, I do recommend printing this one using the layers function, because it's going to allow you just to print only your size. So I will drop a link in the description box with a blog post that I have that shows you exactly how to print that way. And that way you'll have a nice clean, you'll only see your size on the pattern. The other thing, it is a large pattern. So if you have a little bit of time to wait, I do think that it's going to be a lot easier if you print this in the A0 large format printer paper. I will also drop some links in the description box for Patternsy, where you can send them the file and then they'll send you the printed pattern. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of taping. So I apologize in advance. It is a large pattern because both of the front, the left and the right, have their own pattern piece, and the left and the right facings, and they're quite large with the scarf. So it is a large pattern. I apologize in advance if you have to tape those, but I'll drop some resources for A0 printing in the description box. So I'm going to get to cutting. I'm going to lay out my pattern. And because I'm using a vintage fabric, I always trace my pattern pieces with a pen that disappears with the iron, with heat. So I trace my pattern pieces, make sure I have the placement the way I want it before I cut, because obviously you only get one chance to cut. So I'm going to take my time and get my pattern pieces cut out, and then I will see you when we start sewing. My pieces cut, and I'm going to start by sewing the center back seam of my back, my outer back, and I'm also just going to go ahead and sew the center back seam of my lining. Once I have my seams sewn, I'm going to press the seam allowances open, but I wanted to share a quick tip if you don't already know this. If you are sewing with a wool, and sometimes when you press your seams can show through like a ridge on the right side. So what I like to do is just take a couple strips of brown paper bag and just slide them under my seam allowances. So with this cotton, I actually am not going to need it, but I'll just show you. You just slide the paper bag under your seam allowances as you press them. And that way it will prevent your seam allowances from making an indent on your fabric on the right side. So I'm going to get to pressing my seams open. Ooh, hot. Okay, now that we've got our center back seams sewn and pressed open on our outer fabric, as well as our lining, So the center back seam pressed open on both. I've gone ahead and just done a row of stay stitching along my lining back seam, neck seam. And stay stitching is just a line of stitching, just a scant, so 5/8 is just right here. So I've just sewn a line right inside of the 5/8 of an inch, and this just helps keep my neck from stretching out as I sew it to the collar. Normally I would do a line of stay stitching on my outer fabric as well, but this fabric is not going anywhere. So I omitted the stay stitching on my outer. So now what we're going to do is sew the collar to both our outer fabric as well as our lining. So the thing about the collar is you'll notice one side is shorter and one side is longer. The longer side also has a notch right at the center back. So that is the side with that notch. We're going to place it right at center back. So the longer side of your collar is what gets attached to the neck. I know it's a little like you might think, oh no, but it's this way because it follows a similar shape. But trust me, it's the long side, and that way you're going to get a little bit of like a body shaping with the collar. So I'm going to pin this on. I think I need my thicker pins for this. So I'll start by just pinning the center back. You know what else I'm going to do? Because this is such a thick fabric, we're going to do this in a couple other places. I'm just going to trim out a bit of the seam allowance. So all I've done is just about an inch from my cut edge. I've just trimmed out some of that bulk. I can just feel that it's a bit bulky, so I want to get rid of some of that. So now right sides together, I'm going to start with my center back matching that notch. I have a marking. And then I'll go to my shoulder edge and just pin here and the other one. And just matching up those cut edges. Then kind of wiggle it a bit. And this is where the stay stitching on a stretchier fabric can kind of come in handy because it's going to hold your neck in place. I'm just going to place another pin there and another pin here. Just kind of making sure that it lays smooth. And then I'm going to sew 5/8 of an inch along my collar, and then we can kind of see what it's going to look like. So then it lays nice and smooth with that curve once we sew it in. So I'll do the exact same thing to my lining. So I'll just place right sides together, starting at center back and so on. Okay, so now I have sewn that seam along my collar, also along my lining, and when we flip it up, we can see it is pulling a bit with the seam allowance. So what I'm going to do first is press this open as best I can, and then I'm going to trim my seam allowances to about 1/4 of an inch so that one, we take out some of the bulk, and two, so that this lays nice and smoothly along my neck. But I like to press it open as much as I can first and then trim it because it's a little bit easier to press open when you have more seam allowance there. So I just give it a press. And then I'm going to take I love these pelican bill scissors. And so I'm going to use those to trim my seam allowance to just about 1/4 of an inch. I'll do both sides. Okay, and then once I have my seam allowances trimmed, then I'll go in and just press it again now that it lays flat, and just give it a really, really, really good press. And there we have our neck seam, our collar, in from the front. So I'm going to do the same thing to my lining. So with my lining, I actually just folded or pressed all of the seam allowance down towards the body of the garment, towards the lining. Because the lining is so fine and this seam lays a bit flatter, I decided to do that. So I pressed it all towards the lining. Okay, now what we're going to do is tackle our pockets. So I've gone ahead and just placed all 4 of my pockets right sides together at the markings along the side seam. And I'm going to sew these with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So 1/4 inch from here to attach our pockets. And then we're just going to press them away from our jacket, and then we'll sew our side seams. So I'll start by sewing a 1/4 of an inch from each top to bottom of the pocket. Okay, so I've sewn my pockets, and now I'm just going to press each of the pockets away from the garment, keeping the seam flat. So I'm just pressing the pocket away from the body of my garment, like so. This is a standard side seam. So if you've done a side seam in a pair of like easy pants or something, this is exactly the same, which is one of the reasons why I love this coat, because these pockets are so simple. So I'm just going to press all 4 of my pockets away, and then we're going to sew the side seams. Okay, so now I'm going to just match up the side seams. Let's see, I need this side. So I'm going to match the side seams right sides together. And I just wanted to show you because of the forward side seam. So normally a side seam would be here at the lower part of our sleeve, but I've moved it forward several inches so that we have the pocket in a more comfortable spot. So because of that, we have like really no shape on the front armhole and a lot of shape on the back. So the way this is cut, you just are going to match up that area. You want to match any notches. And then when this gets sewn, it's going to look like this. So we're going to just start sewing at that point of the back, and then 5/8 of an inch down, and then we'll pivot. Let me just get this lined up. And then we'll pivot at the pocket. So we'll sew from here, pivot around the pocket, back up, and then all the way down to the hem. So just make sure you line up this, the underarm part, and you're good to go. So I'm going to sew both my side seams, and then I'll show you how I press them so we get the pocket to lay smoothly. Okay, so now I have my side seam sewn all around the pocket and up to the armhole. And now I'm here at the ironing board, and I'm going to press this seam open, and we're going to press our pocket towards the front. So this is the back, this is the front. So I'm going to want to press my pocket towards the front, but I'm going to be pressing my seam allowance open. And so in order to do that, right here on the back side of my seam allowance, so this is the back, I'm just going to make a little clip right here into the diagonal of where I pivoted to go around my pocket. Just going to clip my seam allowance just like so. And that way my seam allowance will press open above the pocket, and then we're going to do it at the bottom of our pocket as well, just on that back seam allowance, just about 1/8 of an inch away from the corner there. And then underneath or below my pocket, we'll press it open. And then the pocket part, we're going to press towards the front. So here's what we're going to do. I'll just start above, just get this seam pressed open. You can see my little clip there allows my pocket to fall forward. So I'll just make sure, kind of go like this, and just make sure it's nice and taut, and then press my pocket towards the front. And then below the pocket, it gets pressed open again. So that is what it's going to look like. Give this a lot of steam. This is a really heavy, well, not really heavy, but it's a pretty heavy fabric with the quilting. So that's what it looks like from the wrong side. And then I can press it as well from the front, just to make sure the pocket is nice and crisp. Press that pocket towards the front, and then kind of get it the way I want it. And we'll do a press from the outside. And voila, we've got our nice hidden side seam pocket there. So I'll do the same thing to the other side, just making those clips, and then we'll move on to our shoulder seam. Okay, now for the fun part, we're going to sew our shoulder seam. So you can kind of see we've got similar shapes happening with the collar that we sewn on and our front. So I'm gonna just place these right sides together at the shoulder seam and match up my cut edges, and you'll see that the kind of the L shape that is on your front is going to match with the L shape and go all the way up the collar. So I'm just going to pin this in place in mine. So I want the pivot point of my front to match at the seam of my collar. So I'm just placing those together. My shoulder seam lays nice and smooth. I'll put a pin right near that collar seam just to hold it. And then my collar is just a hair longer. I think it's because this fabric is a bit thick, so I'm just gonna kind of ease it in, ease that in a little bit. I think it's just because my fabric is rather thick. This pattern, I will say, it's a good time to mention, it's quite forgiving. So if you have little things like that, don't worry, it's a really forgiving pattern. So now I'll do my other side. Let's see if this one, yeah, this one's just a little, my seam allowances might have been a little off. So then I'll do the same thing to the other side, just pinning my shoulder seams, taking that V from my front and matching it up there with the seam and just placing a pin and just matching, letting that other side just go right up the collar. So this is what it looks like from the front, and then this is what it looks like from the back. So when I sew this, I just want to make sure, try as much as possible to keep this seam open so that it lays, nicely. But what I'm going to do is just sew this, and I'm going to make a slight pivot here at the pivot point and go right back up the collar. And that's going to sew our shoulder seam. Okay, so I'm going to just make sure my needle is in the down position so that every time I stop, my needle will stop in the down position, which just helps me as I kind of move through this. So I'll sew up until I get to my point. Take out my pin. I'm just going to kind of make sure that my seam is open below. I'll just sew. And then right when I get to that pivot point, I'll stop with my needle down. I'm just going to pivot and just sew all the way up the collar. And voila, this is what we have on the back, and this is what we have on the front. All right, so I'm here at the ironing board, and before I give this an iron, I am just going to make that little clip just about 1/8 of an inch away from my seam there, and that way now I can just go ahead and press my seam, my shoulder seam open, and our coat is starting to take shape. We've got an armhole forming and a neckline, so I'll just press this seam open and do the same thing to the other side. So there is our shoulder seam. You can see our clip allows it to lay nice and smooth. So now we're going to shift our focus to the lining. So I have both of my front facings laying right side up, and I'm just going to place each of my front lining right sides together along the front edge, and I'll just pin in place. So the front edge is the side, ooh, these pins are new and they're really tough. So the front is this side with the little notch. So that's the side we're working with. And we're just going to pin each side in place, and then we'll go ahead and sew the lining to the front facing. Okay, and once we have this pinned into place, we're going to sew the entire seam to attach the front lining to our front facings. Okay, so I've sewn my lining to my facings, and now I'm just going to press the seam, each of the seams towards the lining. So this allows my facing just to lie flat and then my lining to fall smoothly. Okay, so now we have a nice crisp seam. This lining is just a bit see-through, but the inside of the jacket is white, so I think it's going to be just fine. Press this one. All right, and now that I have this all pressed, I'm going to now sew my shoulder seams the same way that we did with our outer piece. We're going to do this with our lining pieces. Okay, so here I have my back lining piece that we've already sewn the collar on. Just going to match up my shoulder seams. And just like we did on our outer, we're going to do a little pivot right at the collar seam. So I'm just going to match up my collars, match that point, pivot point, right to the seam. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is just sew, just like we did before, make a pivot at my pivot point and then up to the collar. Okay, so I've got my shoulder seam sewn, and just like we did on our outer piece, I'm going to make a clip here just to my pivot point along the front, each of the front seam allowances. I'll just make my clip, and then I'm going to press the seam open and on this side. And then what I'm going to do after I press this open, I'm just going to go ahead and then sew the side seam of my lining and press that seam open as well. So I'm going to press this open and then sew my side seams, and then we'll be ready to move on to the sleeves. Okay, so I've gone ahead and just sewn the side seams of my lining and pressed the seam open. So now I have my lining shell and facings ready for the sleeves as well as my body. So we're going to kind of do a little assembly line here. We're going to sew our outer sleeves and get the sleeve cap ready. And we're going to do the same thing to the lining all at once because it's the same. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to sew a line of gathering at the top of the sleeve between, oh, I didn't cut the notches. So first I'm going to mark my notches on my sleeve cap so that I know which notches, and then I'm going to sew a line of gathering between the outermost notches. So that's basically just in this area of each of my sleeve cap. Just sew one line of gathering from that point to that point on all of my pieces, my two outers and the sleeve cap of my two linings. Okay, so I have my line of gathering between my innermost notches on all of my sleeves. And so now I'm just going to place each of my sleeves right sides together and sew the side seam of my sleeve. So this seam, I'll sew each of them, and then I'll press the seam open, and then we'll be ready to put our sleeves into the body of our garment. Okay, so I've gone ahead and sewn each of the seams of my sleeve in order to get my sleeve constructed. And before I start, I'm actually going to just trim out some of the bulk from the armhole seam of my sleeve. So I do that by just clipping just like that to clip out the bulk from my seam allowance of this armhole. And I'll do the same on my jacket. So this is my jacket side seam. I just kind of grab the seam allowance and just trim it out a little bit, just like that. So we're trimming away some of the bulk. I actually don't do it on the top of my shoulder. I like the seam allowance there, but you definitely can if you're using a really, really thick fabric. So now what I'm going to do is with each of my sleeves, I'm just going to, first you have to figure out, of course, which sleeve goes on which side based on your markings and the seams. So what we're going to do is just, let's see, this is the back, yeah. So the first thing I like to do is match up my seams because this is an area where you want it to be kind of pretty. So the sleeve seam is also forward to match the forward side seam. And so these two seams intersect nicely. So I just kind of make sure that those are matched up first, and I'll place a pin there. These pins are not going to be thick enough. I need to use these. Ooh, these are new pins, and oh my gosh, they're really stiff. I don't know what is the problem with them, but they don't want to go through the fabric. Okay, so then I just keep working my way around the sleeve, just lining up my notches. And by the notches, you're going to understand which is the front and which is the back. So the double notches are going to match up with the double notches. And then what we're going to do is just slowly start to pull up our gathering thread at the top of the sleeve cap. The important thing to notice here though is we don't want actual gathers. We're going to smooth this out because this gathering is meant to shape the sleeve just a bit. It's not meant to actually be gathered. So it's not like a puffed sleeve or anything like that. So we're just kind of gathering it up just to give the sleeve a little bit of shaping. So I'm just going to pull it up ever so slightly on either side until it gives me the shaping that allows me to match up all my notches and get my sleeve set in. And then when I sew this, I'm just going to be double sure that that I'm not getting like any puckering there. I'm just going to make sure it's all smoothed out once I go to sew. And I'm going to be sewing this from the sleeve side. So I'll be sewing it just as I'm working with it now. This is the sleeve obviously up, and that's how I'm going to be sewing it. So I can definitely take a look and make sure that I'm not getting any gathers. I'm just getting a nice smooth seam, but it is just shaped ever so slightly. So I've got that all. These pins are horrible. I need to get some others. So I've got my sleeve all pinned in. And so as I sew this, I'll just make sure all these are nice and smooth. And then I also like to sometimes just double check my seam there. So you can see this is the side seam of my jacket. This is the seam of my sleeve, and they intersect nicely there. That's just one thing that I like to just double check because it does kind of show when you're wearing the garment. So it's nice to have it a little bit exact there if you can. And then my sleeve. So I am ready to sew in the sleeve. I am going to just first pin in my other side, and because we're doing a little bit of an assembly line, I'm actually going to pin in my lining sleeve as well, and I'm just going to do the same thing, like pulling up the gathers in order to shape the sleeve cap and get it to fit. So I'm going to do all 4 sleeves, and then we will take it to the sewing machine. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to sew in my first sleeve. So I just picked a part of the sleeve that isn't in the most curved part, just so it's a little easier to get started. So we're going to sew the first row of stitching at 5/8 of an inch. So now I'm approaching my sleeve cap. So I've got my gathering. Just gonna make sure to smooth out the gather so I'm not actually getting any puckers. And I'll just make my way all the way around. Oopsie. always like to have my needle stop in with the, have my machine stop with the needle down because I'm kind of maneuvering my way around, making sure that everything is smooth. Helps to just keep everything in place. Oopsie. Okay, so we've got it. That was a little bit of a wrangle. This fabric is a little thicker than the others that I've done. So all looks good. Just making sure there's no puckers or anything. So I'm going to go back and just sew a second line of stitching just about 1/4 of an inch or so away from my original stitching line. And then we're going to use this stitching line to trim some of the seam allowance away out of our sleeve, our armhole. So I'll do that second line of stitching and then I'll meet you at the ironing board. Okay, so here we have our armhole. This is our side seam of our jacket. This is the top. So what I'm going to do is just between like the lowermost notches, I'm just going to trim out the seam allowance to that second row of stitching. So essentially what we're doing is just taking out the bulk from our seam allowance in the underarm area. And then we're going to actually use the bulk of the seam allowance in the sleeve cap just a bit to give us, you know, a little bit of body in the sleeve cap. But down here in the underarm, I don't want the bulk. So I just trim it away very close to that second row of stitching. And then you can see that second row of stitching just kind of helps hold everything nice and neat and gives me the place to cut. And then above, it just kind of helps hold everything together. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to press the sleeve, the seam allowance towards the sleeve. And it's just going to, that seam allowance that's left just kind of helps us keep a nice filled in sleeve cap. But it lays kind of more smooth because we've secured it with that second row of stitching. So now I'm just going to kind of switch over here. I'm going to use I have this, let's see, this little arm that comes out. You could also use a ham or whatever you have, or nothing. If you have nothing, don't worry. Just kind of, you know, all we're doing really is just pressing the seam allowance towards the sleeve to get a nice, neat sleeve cut. So I just kind of work my way around. Kind of just getting a nice clean seam. I'm really big on pressing. I feel like pressing so many times can make the difference between a garment that looks kind of homemade or unfinished versus one that looks really professional. So I like to give it a good press. I can kind of press the underarm a bit as well. So now my sleeve, ooh, that is looking really, really nice. So it's just nice and smooth, no puckers, but just ever so slightly a nice shape that as this kind of, it's a bit of a drop shoulder. So as this kind of falls off my shoulder, it has that nice just bit of shaping. So I'm going to continue with the second sleeve as well as my lining. And then we are almost ready to sew the outer edges of this jacket. We're almost done. We're in the home stretch. Okay, so at this point we have our outer jacket completed. We have the sleeves in, and now we have a one whole raw edge all along the outside of our jacket. And then for our lining piece, we have our sleeves in and we have our lining attached. And so we have our completed lining piece as well. So what I have on my table is I have my coat piece right side up with all of my outer edges, kind of lying as flat as they'll go. And then what I'm going to do is just take my lining piece, right sides, so right sides together. So put right side down on my lining piece, and I'm just going to start kind of lining up my outer edges. So I'm just going to, I can first start with any seams. So my collar seams, we should have done this before, is actually just like we've done in other areas. I'm going to just trim out some of my seam allowance. You may not need to do this depending on what fabric you use. I'm doing this because this fabric is quite bulky, and this just is going to make these points just a little bit less bulky and easier to turn right side out, which you'll see in a minute. Because what we're going to do is actually just sew our coat to our lining right sides together, and then we're going to turn it right side out, and our coat is going to be nearly done after that. So I'm just going to start by lining up little by little the lining to my outer jacket. Go down here, just lining up those cut edges all the way, and it's just gonna fit together. So you just want to make sure you get your seams lined up, because those are the most most visible, I would say. And then our scarf point here, lining up. And once I've got enough pins where I feel like I can navigate it, I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, and I'll sew 5/8 of an inch seam all the way around. So I'll start here, work my way all the way around the scarf. Let's just place a pin here, kind of in this curve here. So we'll start at the hem, work our way all the way around the scarf. We're going to pivot, and then go all the way around the neckline. We're going to cover the collar, sew, and then we'll come around to the other side of the front. We'll pivot here, and we'll sew all the way down to the hem. So pretty simple, just 5/8 seam allowance, and we're going to sew all around our jacket. Okay, so I have my entire outer seam sewn, and so now I'm going to show you how I get the neatest finish on this edge before we turn this inside out. So what I do is I'm just kind of opening or just putting my seam over my ironing board, and I'm going to press that entire seam open as much as I can, reach. So I almost can get it all the way around, and by pressing this open first, it's going to allow us to get a much crisper outer seam once we turn this inside out. So first, I'm just going to go through and press everything that I can. It's a little hairy, but as much as I can get this thing pressed out, it's so much easier. So kind of just feeding this onto my ironing board. So then this is the collar. So I'm just going to try to press it as much as I can. Okay, so I've pressed my seam open as much as I can. Even down the scarf, I was able to get a bit of that pressed out. So now before we turn this inside out, we need to do some trimming. So we're going to start by just clipping all of the corners So the corners of the scarf, I'm just gonna cut diagonally across the corners about 1/8 of an inch or so away from the pivot point where we pivoted with our machine. So just clipping diagonally at all of the corners, the 2 points of the scarf, and then on the other front side. And then what we're gonna do is grade the rest of the seam allowances. So all we're gonna do is just on the facing side of the seam allowance, so the seam allowance that is from our facing with the lining, that seam allowance we're going to trim down to just about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm just gonna trim that seam allowance all the way around the entire coat, just trimming that one side so it's just a bit shorter than the other. And this just allows the bulk of our seam allowances to lay nice and smooth, and because the bulk is kind of distributed throughout the seam allowance rather than like stacking the seam allowances on top of each other. Okay, so I have all of my seams graded, my corners clipped really good. So we're ready to turn this right side out, and we're gonna see our coat taking shape. So exciting. So I'm just gonna make sure to get all of my corners kind of pushed out so they're as square as possible. So what I like to do is kind of pull them out as much as possible so they're kind of soft now. And then I just do this. And I kind of just like help pull out the corner. I might actually use a little, like a corner turner thing too, just to get these really nice and crisp. So that's my scarf end. It's looking really good. And then all the way, I can even pull my lining through the sleeves. So we're getting that all positioned. Pull this corner out. I'm gonna need my point turner for these. Pretty heavy. So now that I have this all turned inside out, I'm just gonna work on my corners a little bit more, get those nice and crisp, and then I'm gonna give this a good press in place. But you can see, since we already pressed this flat, it is so easy to just, the seam just kind of falls in place and you get a really, really, really nice, neat finish along your coat edge. So I know like it's hard to get in the collar area to press things flat, but it makes such a big difference when you go to turn it inside out. So I highly recommend doing that. So I'm just gonna press out my corners and then give this a good, good, good press. And then we'll be ready to do the hem. Okay, so I've got my jacket all nice and pressed all along that outer edge, and it's looking really, really, really nice. I've tried it on and I am loving the way it's turning out. So these are my corners. This fabric was fairly thick, but that's about as good as I could get them. Pretty okay with it. So before we get to our hem, we just need to do one finishing detail around the neckline. So, so what I'm doing, and then I'll also show you, I've already pressed up the hem, but first I'm just gonna open out my jacket, and maybe if we go a little farther away. So just opening out my jacket, and then I'm going to, so basically what we need to do is secure our neckband or secure our collar. So I have a needle and thread, and I'm just gonna go up through the lining, so to the inside of my jacket and up to where my collar, my outer collar meets my lining collar, and just get those lined up. They naturally line up, and I am just going to do a really loose slip stitch between the seam allowances in order to tack these together. That way it's not going to be slipping as I'm wearing this. I did knot this thread. So I'm just gonna, this doesn't have to be anything fancy at all. I just take some really kind of loose, I'm not pulling like super tight. I want it to be, I want it to just have a little bit of room to breathe. but I will kind of pull it tight. So I'm just going to do this slip stitch all the way across the seam to secure these together. Okay, and I'll just tie a nice strong knot, a couple knots here. And then we have our neckband or our collar all secured inside of our jacket. So now you can see when you go to put it on or hang it up, that collar is nice and secure and your lining is nice and secure. So now we can move down to the hem. So I have already gone ahead and pressed up my hem. So I tried the jacket on just to make sure that I liked the length. Here's a stain, so that was lucky to cover it up. So I've already pressed up the amount that I would like to hem my jacket. And I've also gone ahead and done the same thing with my sleeves. So I've just another stain. So I got really lucky on covering some of the stains. So I've just pressed up my hem, the sleeves, and the lower. And so this is the facing. So the facing is going to fold in. And I've gone ahead and just pressed up even through all the way through the facing. So the same amount on all of your outer fabric parts. And then on my lining, I've pressed under 5/8 of an inch along the edge. So I got as close as I could here to the edge, just pressed up my 5/8 of an inch. So hopefully that helps to kind of see how I've prepared. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is just go around my hem and I'm going to trim out some of the bulk from my seams. So I like to just cut out just until a little bit above where my fold is. So just to there, I've cut out the bulk, and I'm just going to do that to all the areas, all the seams, I mean. Okay. That way, my hem is not going to be as bulky. So the next step is to go through and, I mean, you can, if you wanted to, you could go and you could do um, a machine blind hem just to hem this up. But I prefer to do it by hand, and it's pretty quick. And especially with these thicker fabrics, we can just go and we're just going to slip stitch this hem in place all the way to the facing as well. And then just to kind of give you a glimpse of how we're going to finish this, then once we have our hem secured, we're going to fold over the facings along that center front so it'll be nice and clean there. And then what we're going to do is where this facing meets our outer jacket, we're just going to do an invisible stitch to secure these together. So the facing and the front kind of become one there at the bottom, and that will be that. And then we'll have to go through and just slip stitch the lining as well underneath here. So just a couple of steps, a little bit of hand sewing. This is really nice to do at the end of the day, kind of relaxing. So I'm going to get to my hem. Okay, so I have my entire hem just slip stitched, and I wanted to show you that on the view A, the shorter version, you can just tuck the pocket in. You don't actually, it's just falls right where the pocket seam is, but you can just kind of neatly tuck the pocket in. And then we're going to go to the front facing edge. So this is the center front where we folded over our facing. And now we have this opening between the outer part of our jacket and the facing. And so this is what I wanted to show you how we're going to finish this. So right along this edge, it's like a little mouth kind of. I am just going to do a kind of a hidden stitch. So I have my thread here, my needle threaded, and I have I have it knotted. So I'm just going to come up on the facing side. I just kind of bury it under through my hem and just come out right on that folded edge. And I'm just going to position this nice and neat. You can also pin this if you'd like, just to keep everything in place. But what I'm going to do now is just go, actually I'm doing this from the wrong direction. I'm just going to kind of turn this around. So it's lined up again. So what I do is I just go in through one side and out, and then I go to the facing side, and I'm just going in and then out by about like a ½ inch or a ¼ inch, kind of depending on how thick your fabric is. You can also just kind of test. Sometimes I'll do like a ¼ inch and sometimes it gets a little bit bigger. But I'm just going in one side and out, and then going to the other side, in and out. And I'm kind of trying to keep my stitches just on the very inside of the fold. So not necessarily on the top side, if I can help it. Because what this does is kind of bury the stitches. Like you can't even see the stitches that I've made because they're just buried and they're really small. And that way the lower edge of our coat is nice and neat and secure, and you don't even see these stitches. And it's pretty fast to do. And so we just keep doing this. We're going to do this on both sides, and that's how we're going to secure this. And so now when we come to the end, I just want to note, don't be afraid to really pull your stitches tight. You don't really want this to be loosey-goosey. You want to pull it tight so that your two edges just like come together nicely. So now I'm at the end. I'm just going to do a little knot as much as I can, kind of hidden. Do a couple of knots. And then what I do, once I've knotted this, I just put my needle through my fabric just a little bit and pull it through, and then I cut my thread here. So I kind of bury so that I'm not cutting the knot and having like the knot thread tail kind of hanging out there. So that is how I finish the front edge. And then you have a nice invisible bottom here. The facing is nice and secure from both sides, from the inside and the outside. Next, we're going to move on. Well, first I'm going to do the other side of my facing. So I'm going to finish this side of our facing, our little mouth. And then I'll show you how I attach the lining. Okay, so I have all of my facing, both of my facings secured. And now we just need to connect or finish our lining. So I had already pressed under 5/8 of an inch along the lower edge of my lining. And now what I'm going to do is, just using my seam points, is I'm just going to place my lining about matching the raw edges. So I'm just placing the lining about 5/8 of an inch down from the hem of my outer jacket. Doesn't have to be exact, but just about that 5/8 of an inch. And I'm just going to place a pin. So we just kind of secure our lining, and then I'll go to the next seam point and do the same thing, just kind of securing this down, and I would do it with all of my points. And so there we can see the lining just lays flat, and this is where we're just going to do a slip stitch to attach our lining. And here at the facing, it gets a little bit tight, so we're just going to get the lining up there as much as we can. And I'll start just about here. So there's going to be maybe an inch or so where the lining isn't attached, but it's attached to the facing, and so it's going to be plenty secure. Okay, so I'm just going to pull my needle up and kind of bury that thread tail underneath so it's gone. And then I just here, we can either do the same stitch that we did along the lower facing where you go in one side and out the other. I generally just do kind of a slip stitch because you're not going to see this, and for me it's just more of an enjoyable stitch to do. I just kind of catch. So I'm just securing the lining to the hem. So I'm only going through the fabric of my hem, not through to the outer jacket. And I literally just go along and I just secure, slip stitch this lining right to the hem. And the hem is already secured, so this isn't going to be going anywhere. And that is how we finish this. So then I would do the exact same hem, first hemming the jacket and then placing the lining over for each of my sleeves. And then our jacket is complete. Well, almost complete. I forgot to mention the snap or button closure. So I'm going to be honest, on my wool versions of the coat, I actually haven't been adding any kind of closure because the fabric has enough friction together that the scarf, it stays closed really well. But I've already worn this coat earlier today, and without the snap, this fabric is kind of a little bit more slippery. And so I came back and I sewed on the snap. And it reminded me that we didn't cover this. So the snap or buttonhole goes on the one side of the front, and then your button or the other side of the snap goes right here at the point where your collar and the lining seam and everything right at that point. And then the front just crosses under and snaps in, and that keeps it nice and secure. Or you have your buttonhole and your button and you just slide the button through, and that keeps the collar or the right side in place, and then the scarf can just fall over. So yeah, so you can use a button or you can use a big snap. With this fabric, I just didn't want to do a buttonhole because it is quite thick. And so I just opted for some snaps, just hand sewing those in.